with Amira Hass, who's a friend of mine, a very fine Israeli journalist whom most of you will know and read, and if you don't, you should, for Haaretz, a woman who's infinitely braver in her reporting of the brutal circumstances of the Israelis in her columns in Haaretz than any American journalist is in reporting from the Middle East. And we were talking again about what the job of a foreign correspondent is. And I was recalling that when I was at my first newspaper in Newcastle upon Tyne. How many people here have been to Newcastle upon Tyne? Yeah, I'm sorry. Have any of you been to the small town north of Newcastle called Blythe? Mercifully, no. Oh, one, I'm so sorry about that. It's awful, isn't it? Terrible place. It's a coal mining port where you have to watch out where the vomit is when you walk down the street on Sunday morning outside the pubs. Anyway, that's where I started. And there they taught us 50-50 journalism. You're covering a football match, Blythe Spartans against, excuse me, Gateshead United. So half your report has to be for Blythe Spartans, and then you do what, write about what Gateshead United did. Similarly, a local authority inquiry into building a new freeway. You report the local authorities' needs to have this wonderful new highway for the public good. Then you report the protesters and why they can't, drive this highway through rivers, lakes, and forests. 50-50 journalism. And I'm afraid that what's happened is we've taken this false idea of neutrality into the Middle East, like journalism school, ME, Middle East. And we're trying to report the Middle East as if it's a football match, when in fact it's a bloody tragedy. And I often make the point to my colleagues in the Middle East, if you're reporting the slave trade, if we could, in the 18th century, we wouldn't have given half our story to the slave ship captain. We would have reported the slaves and recorded the number of slaves thrown overboard in the voyage from Africa to America. If we were present at the liberation of a Nazi extermination camp, we wouldn't give half our report to the Nazi reasons for hating the people they had murdered. When I was in Sabra Shatila in 1982, climbing physically over decaying corpses, I didn't give half my story over to the reasons why the Israelis watched and did nothing. I gave my story over to the survivors and wrote about the dead. When I was in Jerusalem, August of 2001, and a bomb went off, suicide bomber, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, in the Sbarro pizzeria, killed 16 Israelis, more than half of them children. I did not give half my story to the Islamic Jihad spokesman, because I think it is a duty of a foreign correspondent to be neutral and unbiased on the side of those who suffer. And whoever they may be. But I have to finish by saying my little rant now, that I don't think you're going to get any different reporting. I think we're still going to go on hearing about the barrier, the disputed land, the peace process, the roadmap, keep the fence around the Palestinians, key players will sort it out. There's another lovely phrase we have, key players. And we'll be reminded all the time what this is about. Terror, 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 terror. Your time to attack me now.
Thank you. We're on. Terror, 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 terror. I have to repeat it 6.
Should we do it together?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay. Terror, 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 terror,
terror,
terror,
terror.
That's it. You got it.
But this is the conversation that we have in this country. And the conversations about terror for the Arab and Muslim community, they have to stand up and say, I condemn terror, I condemn terror, I condemn terror, I condemn terror, I condemn terror.
Can we have it once more?
I condemn terror.
Okay, that's enough.
And then at the same time, they have to articulate for you what the Middle East, what the Arab world is. And I think I'm always reminded by Edward Said when in Orientalism and in Covering Islam, he says, as he reads the coverage and the press, descriptions of the Arab and Muslim world, he says it does not resemble anything that he knows about the Arab and Muslim world, which really gets me to the whole notion of how we construct the image of the Arab and Muslim world. It's an imagined world. And you spoke about words, you spoke about how we frame these words, and I think we need to say that the role of the journalist, the role of the reporter, and I think we understand it during the Iraq invasion and Afghanistan, the role of the embedded journalist. And I think that's a term that for us we have to understand the role of the embedded journalist. And I asked you earlier for us to think about the role of the embedded intellectual. Because the journalist essentially is promoting the view and the narrative of the imperial forces as they march, but the role of the embedded intellectual is to glorify the history and to recruit new practitioners that will dream the dreams of their forefathers to go and conquer and conquest. And I think if we put those two together, we understand some of the problems structurally in reporting and in the media, that you possibly are a unique voice that counters the tremendous misreporting, lies, and coverage in relation to the Middle East.
Look, I think the first thing to realize is that there are lots of other reporters who are trying to do what I'm trying to do, which is basically turn the story 180 degrees in the other direction, which makes people, I mean, there's two reactions to this. First of all are the people who say, thank you for suggesting there's another side to the story. The other one is what happens to all laptops, which I touch, total disk failure. There's no connect. Mm-hmm. And you see one of the problems of creating the grammar that we have for the Middle East. I mean, we do it for, Latin America too, the whole Chavez business, but primarily the Middle East, is that we have not only created a grammar, but you have accepted this grammar to the point that any other way of explaining the Middle East becomes incomprehensible to the reader and the viewer. I can't remember, it was on a very safe radio show somewhere in Houston. And the guy kept saying, Mr. Fisk, I really don't understand what you're trying, what are you trying to say? He wanted, you see, peace process, he wanted war, he wanted fence, he wanted a negotiation, and compromise is another word we love, right? It's the loser who compromises always, that's part of the way the balance is. Mm-hmm. And I think the same thing happens, by the way, with the Armenian genocide, the mass murder, deliberate mass murder of 1.5 million Christian Armenians by the Ottoman Turks in 1915. There again, I noticed that I was giving a genocide memorial lecture in Toronto in April when the Armenians commemorate their dead, just as, in Britain there's a Holocaust Day where primarily Jews commemorate the dead of the Jewish Holocaust. And I noticed that the television interviewer before the program kept referring to deadly massacres. I want you to think about that phrase for a moment. Because obviously there are a lot of massacres in which the people stand up and walk away afterwards, right? The reason for this lovely phrase, which I took up later in front of her executives during the speech, was that, of course, on the one hand, there's a lot of Armenians in Canada, but there's an awful lot of Turks in Toronto, which is where the broadcast was being made from. That's where I was. And on the one hand, she couldn't get away with massacres on its own because behind me on the screen was a big picture, a gruesome picture of Armenian dead. But she couldn't say genocide because, the world will fall down from the Turks. So we arrive with deadly massacres. Now, that is the kind of contortion which we now go along with. And that phrase, remember, it's also a deadly raid. The Turkish, the Israeli attack on the Turkish boats has become a deadly raid. It wasn't a deadly massacre. It wasn't as big as that, but it was a deadly raid. I think, if you go back to what you were first asking, the mere fact that we journalists use the word embedded tells you the degree to which we've fallen. Before that, we used to have I've never been embedded, by the way, and I've never worn a military costume like some of my colleagues. Before the embedding, they called it a pool. You were supposed to swim in it, I suppose. But there's more to it than just that, and I think you have to realize, and I'll go on to the empire thing in a minute. What was very significant, for example, and it's quite funny, but it's also rather sinister. In 1990, when the journalists' world gathered in Saudi Arabia to cover the forthcoming liberation of Kuwait, which was indeed liberated, although its owners didn't seem to be terribly grateful to us. They paid for the war, which was the main thing. What happened was that I would go out on my own into the desert and find, US Marine units sitting with 3 tanks, bored and hot and frightened because they'd never been abroad before in many cases. And they're all writing poetry. And they're all writing funny stories, some of them with a lot of humor, some of them quite good. And they'd show it to me. Once or twice I'd managed to get the piece in the paper. These are the days, the internet existed, but I actually got the paper to Saudi Arabia and traipsed out miles across the desert and handed over the papers to the Marines so they could read what they'd written. But the awful thing was that back in Dhahran, all these journalists were arriving from the United States in military costumes. One of them turned up from Denver, it was Denver, with camouflaged boots with leaves painted on. those of you who've been to a desert or seen one will note there is a singular lack of trees, you know, in the desert. But what was interesting, all the Marines obviously wanted to be journalists, and all the journalists wanted to be soldiers. And this is part of the osmotic thing I'm talking about, the degree of closeness. We want to be close to power, especially military power. But I think the point about the empire, you see, is a bit more. Empires, historically, must project power in order to survive. And the only way in which empires can project power is by threatening states outside the empire or by going in and invading them. And this is obviously a kind of chemical physics lesson. How do you invade them and get away with it without the empire crumbling? The Romans had quite a good idea, and I'm not recommending crucifixion. They regarded all people outside the Roman Empire, outside their borders, as being barbarians. That's where we get the word from. But once they took these people into the empire, they made them all citizens of Rome. I once recommended to a huge CIA officer in a place called Kufa in Iraq, it was just before the Spanish ran away from their base there after the Madrid bombings, that if America had offered passports to all the Iraqis, because you loved them so much, that's why you liberated them, on arrival, there wouldn't have been an insurgency. The people would have loved you for your generosity because the West would not have reached out like Obama does during his Nobel Prize for public speaking. You would actually have shown them physically and freely that you cared for them. I don't think, by the way, the Iraqis would have all rushed to come to JFK or Heathrow Airport in London. They would have visited on a holiday. They would have loved you for giving them the benefits of your citizenship, and you would have a tremendous economic relationship with the new and grateful Iraq. It wasn't an idea that commended itself to George W., of course, but there you go, or to Mr. Blair. But you see, journalists, they are part of the projection of power. It's very exciting to actually advance with an army. I've advanced with all kinds of armies, many of them extremely unpleasant and gruesome. I've advanced with the Iranian army, then I've advanced with the Iraqi army, then I've advanced with the Syrian army, and I've retreated with the whole bloody lot. It's my problem in journalism, or issue in America, that I'm always in sort of Stalingrads with the people I choose to be with. I actually was with the Israelis several times in Lebanon, and they retreated too, so the Fisk curse affects all armies, you see. But I think that when you see these things, especially if you're embedded, you become part of the empire. You become part of this projection of power. It's exciting. It's a historic moment. We called the Oslo Agreement that. But there you go. And suddenly you start reporting, well, our leading tanks are just approaching Baghdad. We're on the Tigris River. There's been some collateral damage. We've seen some terrible things, etc. Collateral damage, another word, right, which is seeped in. And then we use it without quotation marks, for God's sakes. We mean civilians we killed, as opposed to innocent civilians who are ruthlessly murdered by our enemies. These are collateral, so it didn't hurt as much when we blew them to bits, you see. And I think what happens is that because we have the same nationalities, the armies, in the case of people with the Americans, I tend to not have the same nationality as the armies I'm with, but you feel with them, you see they're young, they're handsome, they're heroic, all the things you've seen on telly. Hollywood comes into it, television movies, The Lone Ranger, Hopalong Cassidy. I grew up on this nonsense. And so we become part of the war, and we're dressed in military costumes, some of us. When I say that to journalists, they hate it because they want to call them uniforms, you see. They're not, they're costumes. They're taking part in the theater, like all the soldiers are. And it's this inability to take even 3 steps back and say, hang on, what is this tragedy I'm involved in? Because it's always a tragedy. If you saw what I saw, I know that this room is full of lefties and pinkos, so there's no problem, but if you had anybody here who believed it was right to go to war and saw what I see, you would never think that again. You know, dead bodies of civilians in bits, dogs coming in to feed off them, carry off a leg over the desert to chew on. It's lunchtime for the dogs of the desert, etc. And that's how we respond, you see. We fail because we can't take the historical step, not historic, but historical step of saying, what the hell is going on here? What are we doing in Iraq? Somebody in Washington says we can change the world. We can go to Baghdad. Our armies can travel across Sahara where civilization first began. And then you get the music and the letters in gold titling and you're back on CNN.
I think you touched on a number of things, and when you were speaking, you spoke about the role of the journalist to challenge authority and to challenge power. From the American side, if you read the journalist,